In this video, we will discuss the civil rights movement of the mid-20th century. The civil rights movement was an organized effort by Black Americans to end racial discrimination and gain equal rights under the law. Busing throughout the United States had been segregated from the very beginning. In the Supreme Court case Morgan v. Virginia, the Supreme Court ruled that a Virginia law enforcing the segregation of public busing that crossed the state lines was unconstitutional. Southern states had ignored the rulings, and the federal government had done nothing to enforce them. Freedom Riders were a group of black and white civil rights activists who rode interstate buses into the segregated South to test the enforcement of the Supreme Court's ruling. The Freedom Rides were organized by CORE, the Congress of Racial Equality, and SNCC, the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee. In some places, the Freedom Riders were arrested. The police even cooperated with the KKK and allowed mobs to attack the riders. Lunch counters throughout the South were segregated. In Greensboro, North Carolina, 4 college students attempted to desegregate a lunch counter at a Woolworth's department store by organizing a sit-in. They sat in the whites-only section and asked to be served. They were denied service. The students stayed until they were forcibly removed by authorities. Another wave of students would then take their place. Other students joined the movement, not only in Greensboro but across the nation, leading to the desegregation of lunch counters across the South. In April of 1963, Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. led a nonviolent campaign of marches and sit-ins against racism and racial segregation in Birmingham, Alabama. He was arrested with several civil rights leaders and marchers. While incarcerated, he wrote a letter defending the strategy of nonviolent resistance to racism. He said that people have a moral responsibility to break unjust laws and had to take direct action. He famously says, "Injustice anywhere is a threat to justice everywhere." In August of 1963, a mass march was organized that would push for civil and economic rights for African Americans. Over 200,000 people peacefully marched on the Capitol. The protest was capped off by the infamous "I Have a Dream" speech delivered by Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. This nonviolent protest is credited with helping to pass the Civil Rights Act of 1964. In Selma, Alabama, Dr. King and the leaders of the civil rights movement wanted to register every adult African American to vote. To achieve this, they planned a march from Selma to the capital, Montgomery. When the marchers reached the Edmund Pettus Bridge, the cops ordered them to disperse. When they refused, the cops charged the marchers and began to beat them and shoot them with tear gas. The march was televised nationally on all 3 major networks. The nation watched in horror. President LBJ ordered Governor Wallace to allow the march and sent in troops to ensure the safety of the protesters. Martin Luther King Jr. led a second march to Montgomery that was peaceful and successful. The Selma March led to the passage of the Voting Rights Act of 1965, which banned literacy tests and guaranteed every adult citizen's right to vote. In 1964, the government acted to correct the problems of segregation and racism. The Civil Rights Act of 1964 banned segregation in public places and banned employment discrimination on the basis of race, religion, or gender. The next year, in response to the Selma March, Congress passed the Voting Rights Act of 1965, which banned literacy tests and other methods of denying African Americans a right to vote. In addition, the 24th Amendment abolished the poll tax, a fee that was charged to people to register to vote. The passage of civil rights legislation was not enough to protect the rights of minorities in America. African Americans wanted greater equality and greater opportunities. American cities had been steadily declining throughout the 1950s and 1960s due to the large numbers of whites moving to suburban areas. Urban areas were filled with poverty and racial injustices. African Americans and other minorities responded to worsening conditions by rioting in the streets, causing widespread destruction and violence. President Johnson was angered by this racial violence. After all he'd done to try to end racism in America, he couldn't understand why this was happening. So he organized the Kerner Commission to investigate the state of race relations in the U.S. The report stated that our country was heading in the direction of 2 separate and unequal societies, one white and one black. American institutions like the police created this racial divide. The Kerner report established that America was filled with racism. Many Americans were tired of so much change so quickly, especially in the South. This feeling of a return to conservatism pushed former Democrat and governor of Alabama George Wallace to run for president in 1968. He ran on a platform of law and order and racial separatism. He tried to remove race from the conversation and focus on conservatism. His message was well received, winning him 5 states, 46 electoral votes, and almost 10 million votes. The time has come for the American Negro to fight back in self-defense, whenever possible and wherever he is being unjustly and unlawfully attacked. This is a quote from another civil rights leader, Malcolm X. Malcolm X was the leader of an organization of black Muslims known as the Nation of Islam. He preached that whites were the cause of the black condition and that blacks should separate from white society. He also advocated armed self-defense over nonviolent protest. Another major civil rights organization was the Black Panthers. Led by Huey P. Newton, they were a political party that thought that African Americans should be exempt from military service because of the unfair number of blacks drafted into the Vietnam War. They wore black leather jackets, black berets, and sunglasses. They preached self-defense and sold copies of the writings of Mao Zedong, the leader of Chinese Communist Revolution. The next civil rights leader is Stokely Carmichael. Carmichael was one of the original Freedom Riders, a member of SNCC, and a supporter of the Mississippi Freedom Democratic Party. Inspired by the words of Malcolm X, he developed the philosophy of Black Power. The Black Power movement pushed for the safety and self-sufficiency of the black community. He wanted black people to define their own goals and to lead their own organizations without white people. Black Power activists founded several black-owned businesses throughout the second half of the 20th century. During a medal ceremony of the 1968 Summer Olympics in Mexico City, 2 black athletes, Tommy Smith and John Carlos, each raised a black-gloved fist during the U.S. national anthem. They had won the gold and bronze medals in the 200-meter sprint. The International Olympic Committee expelled both of them from the remainder of the Olympics for making a political statement. They kept their medals. Malcolm X had split with some of the members of Nation of Islam. Over time, he began to soften his view on separatism and violence. On February 21, 1965, he was shot and killed as he was giving a speech to the Nation of Islam by members of his own party. Martin Luther King Jr. was assassinated by James Earl Ray. On April 4, 1968, a shot rang out as King stood on the motel's second-floor balcony. After emergency chest surgery, King was pronounced dead at St. Joseph's Hospital. King's autopsy revealed that although he was only 39 years old, he had the heart of a 60-year-old man, perhaps a result of the stress of 13 years in the civil rights movement. The assassination led to a wave of race riots in dozens of cities across the nation. On June 6th, Robert Kennedy was assassinated after winning the California Democratic presidential primary. He was shot by Sirhan Sirhan, a Jordanian immigrant who was angry about Bobby's support for Israel. Kennedy had scored a major victory in winning the California primary. Sirhan said that he felt betrayed by Kennedy's support for Israel in the June 1967 Six-Day War, which had begun exactly 1 year before the assassination. The Civil Rights Act of 1968 ended discrimination in housing. African Americans made substantial political gains. Shirley Chisholm from New York became the first African American woman in the House of Representatives. Barbara Jordan became the first African American woman from the South to serve in the House, and she was from Texas. To help equalize education and job opportunities, the government began to promote affirmative action. This involved making special efforts to hire and enroll groups that suffered past discrimination. Many colleges and almost all companies that do business with the federal government have adopted such policy.